Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
My father's family came here from Cuba back in the 60s, and being typical Latinos, all moved into one house in Newark, New Jersey. We're talking about 10 people under one roof. Now this story takes place in '82. I was 2 and my sister was a newborn. My father had moved out and was living on his own with my mother. But I'm not talking about that house. I'm talking about the Latino house, and bear in mind everything I'm telling you guys here is what I've heard from family that's willing to talk about it, so take it for what you will. Things started normal in the house at first, but little things were just off. Like things wouldn't be where you left them, some unexplained noises. A little unsettling, but whatever. But then my aunt started having these crazy nightmares. In them, she was being violently attacked by a man with no head. Her husband would wake her up as she screamed, and she'd tell him how it felt so real. He'd do his best to calm her down and try and bring in some sense of normalcy. Now take this for what you will, but my aunt ended up pregnant. Everyone was happy and rejoicing, as this would be her and her husband's first child, but in the 4th month she went into premature labor. Everyone knew the child would be lost. When the noob was delivered, it did not have a head. I wish I could say the story ends here, but it gets worse. Shit was now being thrown around the house. There were loud bangs and other noises all through the day and night. One of my aunts, a lil old lady about 4 foot 9 inches and 95 pounds, would say that the spirit in the house would talk to her and tell her he didn't like all these people in his house. Now my father is irrational and cool-headed to a psychotic degree. I've seen him nail his hand to a wall, and after failing to pry the nail out himself, cut out the section of wall around his hand, drive to the hospital and ask them to start it so he can get it out. When he was on a plane that they thought was going down and everyone was freaking, he yelled at the other passengers to shut up and accept it. Naturally, he didn't believe in this ghost shit. He thought there was a rational explanation to all of this, and when my lil old aunt would go off about the ghost while he was there or something went down while he was visiting, he'd yell at everyone. All that changed one night when he came speeding home. Before coming to my house, he stopped at my hyper-Christian neighbor's place. He banged on their door at 1 a.m. until they let him in and gave him a bunch of crosses, which he proceeded to put up all over our house. He begged my mother to not sleep and just watch over him while he slept. If my mother got up to feed my sister, he would follow her and sleep at her feet. He also pissed himself several times. My mother asked what happened the next day, but he wouldn't tell her. Finally, she got something out of one of his sisters. Apparently as they were playing dominoes, my lil old aunt was saying that the ghost was here and he's not happy and going through her usual shtick. My father, having had enough, got up and went to her, grabbed her by the shoulders and told her to cut the shit. Then, this lil 4 feet 9 inches 95 pounds woman looked at my father, yelled at him, "Get your fucking hands off me," in a voice not her own, and tossed him across the room. In the same voice, it then addressed the room and said how it's unhappy they were all in his house and that he would not let them leave. They were trying to sell the house at this point because they were too freaked. She said that if they tried to leave, she'd make sure they suffered for eternity with him. One of my uncle's eyes rolled into the back of his head and he started speaking in a strange language that no one could ever identify. My father ran for the hills at this point, leaving there ASAP. He never returned. Eventually they sold the place for $10,000 under market. They all packed their bags for Miami, where all good Cubans eventually go. 30 days after moving into their new house, my 53-year-old grandfather, who was in perfect health, died of what was called a stroke, but if you ask anyone in my family, they'll say the ghost took him. A weird postscript to the story. Many years later my father's family came up from Miami for a visit and decided to hang out at a bar in the old neighborhood. While there, a guy at the bar was eyeing one of my uncles the whole night. Eventually he walked up to my uncle and, without warning, punched him right in the face. As people were dragging him out of the bar, he could be heard yelling, "You know about the house and you sold it anyway, you son of a bitch." That's the ghost story of my family. Believe it or not.
My great-grandfather was a gambler, cheat, thief, drunk and probably murderer. We don't have proof of the last, but it seems reasonable knowing his history. In the late 1880s, he was playing poker and was caught cheating. He was shot 6 times with a Colt single-action Army .45 LC from less than 6 feet away, across the table. As he lay dying, he promised God if he could live, he would change his ways and become a preacher. The town doctor patched him up, with no lasting ill effects. After he got back on his feet, he gave up drinking, gambling, and everything else, and became a preacher. He was an old-fashioned hellfire and brimstone type. His son, my grandfather, rebelling against being the preacher's kid, followed the same road, and became a cheat and gambler, also a drunk. In early 1942, he was caught cheating at a poker game, and was shot twice from across the room with a Colt .45 ACP. He made the same deal as his father: if he could survive, he would renounce his ways and become a preacher. He survived, and my great-grandmother built the church he preached at when he married my grandmother. They didn't have sons, they had daughters. I have been hesitant to pick up cards or drink too much, since it seems like all the males on my side of the family who do tend to be shot for their good times. I should add that the men who shot both my great-grandfather and my grandfather were never found after they shot them. In both cases, they tossed the gun to the ground and ran off. My great-grandfather was given the Colt by the sheriff at the time, after he became the town's preacher, and my grandfather's friend lied to the police and told him the guy had asked to borrow his Colt for some skunks. He was an MP at the time. So my grandfather's friend was given the Colt back after the investigation, and he gave it to my grandfather. My family still has both firearms locked away, stored in naval jelly. We take them out once a decade, clean, shoot, and repack them.
My mom told me a story about when she was younger that was pretty creepy. She said my grandpa had gotten a job replacing a family's carpet or something, and they invited his whole family to come stay in the house while he was doing the job because it was far out in the country. While they were staying there, my mom got to sleep in her own room because she was the oldest. She chose the attic that had been converted into a bedroom. She said every night she tried to sleep there, she got a very specific feeling that a man with an axe was going to come up the stairs and kill her in her sleep. She moved all over the house trying to find places she was comfortable in before finally asking to sleep with her parents. She was a teenager at the time, so she was obviously desperate. That was the end of that until about 20 years later when my mom mentioned that to my grandma. Apparently, the whole time they were in the house, my grandma was terrified she was going to hurt her children. She said they found out after they left the house that something horrible had happened there. I don't know the details, and she never told the kids because she didn't want to scare them.
My paternal grandfather was way into paranormal investigations. He was one of those guys people called when their house was haunted. He was a psychology professor for a profession, but he investigated as a parapsychologist as a sideline hobby. I never got to ask him about it, though. He died when I was 6. My maternal great-great-grandfather died in his house, after he bled out through his anus over the course of 5 days. He sat in his condo for 2 weeks, rotting until the neighbors looked in on him. This happened after he lost most of the property he owned in San Francisco. Turns out my mom's side of the family was some of the original big money in San Fran. That was where the last of the money dried up. That part's not paranormal, but it pisses me off to no end. I have distant cousins who own multiple five-star hotels in downtown San Fran.
My mom, a long while back, was driving my oldest sister home from school one day. She was 15 or 16, she's 46 now. At the time, we lived in the country, so the roads were paved but very rural, and had little traffic except for locals. Anyway, for no reason, she pulled off to the side of the road right before the T intersection in the road. They parked there, probably for 10 to 20 seconds, before my sister started getting impatient and asked if they could go. Just as my mom was telling her okay, two trucks plowed into each other at the T intersection. If my mom hadn't gotten the feeling she needed to pull over right then, they would have been hit by both trucks and more than likely seriously injured or killed. Turns out that type of intuition runs in my family. On the job, I'm a police officer. I've had that type of feeling before, like knowing when someone was hiding in a closet and knowing that they were armed. My partner and myself at the time was shot at through the door when I told him to come out and throw down the gun. I had to shoot him. He survived, fortunately. After we had him in custody, and on the bus heading to the hospital, my partner asked me how I knew he was armed. Couldn't really tell him. Just said it was a hunch since he had known priors. Upon checking, I found out he never had any previous firearms charges, only misdemeanor offenses and one felony drug conviction. I've had other experiences like that, and it's saved me and my partner on more than one occasion.
My aunt lived in a townhouse with her husband, who is now deceased. She is a very spiritual person and believes deeply in the supernatural, while my uncle was a hardcore badass who fought in Vietnam and hated supernatural bullshit. One particular night in 93 feet my uncle awakes to a vivid blue light and my aunt is gone, although her side of the bed is completely pristine as if she had made that side of the bed. Well, he freaks out because none of the lights are on in the house, so he searches everywhere for her. All the doors are locked. He told me he searched every room in the house. He calls the police and they arrive soon after. About 10 minutes into the questioning by the police there was a blue light again which no one had saw except my aunt, who had miraculously appeared from the bedroom. In total, she was gone for about 3 hours. After that, my uncle and aunt had a deep-seated belief in alien abduction, and my aunt has had night terrors of aliens ever since.
Okay, so here's mine. One of my great-grandfathers was a poilu in World War I. He didn't talk often about the war, but after his death my family found out he had done all sorts of crazy stuff like being the last man standing or leaving his cover to rescue wounded comrades under fire. He did tell them this one story though, about this one time, when he didn't lose his entire company to the Germans, but to something else. I'm not sure if I remember correctly all the details of the story, but it's something along those lines. It was a very foggy day, and they were at the time not fighting on a battlefield, but more or less relaxing in the rear. Now my great-grandpa had to separate from the rest of the group for a few minutes to buy some cigarettes or something, while his companions were supposed to wait him somewhere. I think it was on the top of a small hill nearby. So, unsuspecting, he did what he had to do as quickly as possible, and headed towards said place. Turns out he didn't find anything but the fog. He kept searching, until the fog finally cleared up. That's when he realized he wasn't lost at all. There wasn't anybody left, they were all gone, and by gone, what I really mean is that they disappeared. He never heard of them again. Now, you may think they simply deserted. But think about time. Dozens of men at the same time, in such a coordinated fashion? That's just unlikely. Plus, my great-grandpa wasn't even an officer or anything. How could have he possibly been the only to not be part of the conspiracy? You may also think all of this sounds cliché and over the top, but I swear I didn't make it up. It's a genuine spooky family story.
My father is the biggest skeptic and a completely cool rationalist. doesn't talk often unless he feels he needs to, and just exudes a lack of emotion about him sometimes. I have always found his attitude and disposition puzzling because he has always been a believer in God and faithful, but not necessarily overly zealous in appearance. Protestants can't exhibit all that now. Anyways, one time I got him talking about paranormal experiences and he told me a couple neat stories that sort of led him to believe for certain that angels, demons, and God walked among us. When my father was around 22, he and some friends had been racing cars and at one point his car veered off the road and crashed into something, throwing him out of the vehicle. He fell out headfirst several feet away from the vehicle and was barely alive from the get-go. When they got him to the hospital his brain was swelling, he was in a coma, and the family was literally preparing for his burial as the doctor was quite sure he was not going to make it through the night. While he was under, he said he was barely conscious of people coming in and out of his hospital room trying to take care of him, but the entire time there was this elegantly dressed man in black just calmly sitting down near his bed and assessing things from a notepad. At some point, the man gets up and informs my father that there have been some mistakes and that he is not scheduled yet, so he will be waking up soon. My father made a dramatic, puzzling recovery and was out of the hospital in a matter of days. He would not speak to many people about the experience and only told my mother after about 25 years of marriage to her. He also told me of a time he was acquainted with a guy that seemed otherworldly. Back in the 70s and 60s, it was not uncommon for young people to drift in and out of towns with no home, but there was this young man who had some sort of strange, cold ferocity about him. My father said he always rubbed people the wrong way, but my father found him interesting to talk to, and this character apparently had a knack for being able to just coincidentally be in the right place or just up and appear out of nowhere to come hang out and smoke some weed with them. My father said it just happened too much and too coincidentally with someone with no transportation out in a spread-out country town. He likened it to the ability Jesus had to just pop and appear elsewhere a couple times in Scripture. Cannot remember where in Scripture. He appeared on another side of a lake, right after feeding the 5,000 or something along those lines. He said the guy disappeared one day after hanging out for a few months and was never seen again. But there was always something off-putting and unhuman about him that people dismissed as weird. But my father said he could tell it was something more than just that.
This isn't so much something that happened to my family, but merely a family member. Now, my dad's seen a lot of shit in his day, and I know I've only seen the tip of the iceberg when it comes to hearing his life stories. But some of his most interesting are his paranormal ones, of which he's had several. He worked on the Queen Mary for a while and saw several ghosts, but this isn't about that. No, this is about his years as a soldier. My dad was in Vietnam, and of course he had a lot of buddies killed, sometimes right in front of him. Well, when his best friend in the army finally hopped on a plane when his time of service was up, my dad made sure to see him off. As the plane took off and my dad waved goodbye to him, it was shot down by a rocket. One of my dad's first night out of the army, safe and sound back in the US, he had a dream. In that dream, his best friend in Vietnam appeared to him and told him an address, told him to go to it. When my dad woke up, he immediately wrote down the address and went there as soon as he could. Didn't matter how far it was, how much the cost, but he would go. When he arrived, it was a little awkward for him because he had no idea who these people were. But he introduced himself and tried to explain who he was and what he was doing there. It turns out that this address was the home of the parents of his best army friend. Before, he had no idea where his friend had lived or what his parents looked like, but because of a dream, he found his way there. They simply talked for a long time about his friend, their son, and still to this day pays them a visit every once in a while.
My great-grandparents on my mom's mother's side were fairly wealthy before the Great Depression. They had a small grocery store on the outskirts of New Orleans, where the beginning of Metairie is now. They had 5 kids and the bills were always paid. The Depression began to hit in the city no less than 3 weeks after my great-grandmother's first husband died, leaving her to take care of the place by herself. She began recruiting a few of the older kids to help with the shop, and they were still making bills. However, her brother's self-ended due to stress, which left her to take care of 3 more kids. It was getting fairly rough, but she was still getting by. However, the neighbors weren't doing that well. Out of pity, she began giving people long lines of credit, making sure that their families had enough food. Money started to get very tight. It was harder to pay the bills for her and her 8 dependents, but she still kept on making sure everyone was able to afford food in the neighborhood. The older children began to tell her that the other families in the neighborhood weren't her problem, that she needed to put her sanity and her family first. But she wouldn't listen and kept on pushing through till the store was almost of inventory and the second foreclosure letter had arrived from the bank. She had deposited the last bit of money in the cash register to try to appease the bank, but it didn't faze them. Her children were packing up the last bit of food they had at the store for their household while she was sweeping the floor for what she thought was the last time, when a young kid came in to get some food for his sick mom. They didn't really notice him till he was at the counter with his arms filled with some of their last bits of inventory. My great-grandmother went to go ring him up. The total came to $4.24, which was a lot of money back then, but the kid only had 2 bits. She smiled, took the 2 bits and opened what she thought was an empty cash register to find that it was stuffed to the brim with $100 bills. She screamed and my great-uncle ran over there because he thought there was a spider, but he saw the mounds of crinkled $100 bills in the register as well and fainted. No one ever found out where that money came from. My grandmother has always claimed it was a good Samaritan who knew how to pick locks, but her brothers and sisters always disagreed with her.
A few years ago, I was at my grandparents' house and I found an old photograph of a little boy wearing a Triple K outfit that was much too big for him. When I asked who it was, I was told it was my grandfather as a little boy, wearing his dad's Klan uniform. We live in southern Mississippi, so while it was a little upsetting, it wasn't a huge shock. When I asked my grandfather about it, he told me a bunch of stories about lynchings he'd seen or heard about. One story in particular explains a lot of the weird shit that happens to my family. When my grandfather was a young boy, his dad and his fellow Klansmen nched a black man in the woods. They took his body away for whatever fucked up things they needed it for, but they nailed the man's hat to the tree as a trophy, warning, whatever. Several years later, my grandfather, now a grown man with a family, moved into a little house in the woods. One day, while walking through the forest, he came upon a tree, not 100 yards from the house. This tree bore a rusted nail and the tattered remains of an old hat. My family believes that my grandparents' home is on the site of the murder my great-grandfather participated in. My grandparents have reported strange noises and apparitions in their home, and so have 2 of my aunts who live just a few yards away. We don't know if the ghost knows about my grandfather's connection to his murder, but we're certainly not going to tell him.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.